Hey guys, Lady Sky here. It's time to talk about monsters. Sometimes monsters are never caught, cases go cold, families grow old without getting justice. We're going to talk about a few of those today. Our first case is as mysterious as it is short. The YOGTZE case, also known as the Autobahn riddle, or more commonly, YOGTZE fall. On October 25, 1984, Gunther Stoll was sitting at home with his wife, unemployed and suffering from some slight paranoia. He told his wife about them on occasion, them being unknown people who he believed were intending to harm him. He claimed they would eventually kill him. As a matter of fact, he'd mentioned them that very night. Sometime later, Stoll was sitting quietly in the couple's bedroom. He suddenly jumped from his chair and shouted, "I've got it!" As his wife watched, Stoll scribbled on a piece of paper the letters YOGTZE. The G could have possibly been a 6, but I suppose we will likely never know. He immediately crossed these letters out and left the house a short while after. He headed to his favorite pub in Wilmsdorf and ordered himself a beer. However, before he could enjoy it, he managed to fall backward off the stool and injure himself. Witnesses claimed that he didn't appear to be intoxicated, but had suddenly lost consciousness. It was 11 p.m. After this, Stoll returned to his car and drove off. Where he drove and what he did in that time is unknown. These 2 hours of the night are unaccounted for. He then arrived in Heigerzelbach at the home of an old woman he'd known from childhood at 1 o'clock in the morning. She didn't let him in, as it was late. Instead, she suggested that he go home. He agreed to this, but before returning to his car, he mentioned a, quote, terrible incident that would happen soon. Just 2 hours later, at about 3 a.m., 2 truck drivers discovered Stoll's vehicle in a ditch off the Autobahn A45. They discovered Stoll completely naked and barely conscious. Stoll told the 2 drivers that there had been 4 other men in the car with him and they had just taken off. They asked if the men had been his friends, and Stoll said no. The ambulance arrived after this, but Stoll died on the way to the hospital. An investigation was conducted, and it only added to the mystery surrounding the incident. Stoll had not died from the car accident. Instead, it seemed he had been run over by a completely different vehicle, then placed back into his car and driven into the ditch where he was found. They also concluded that he was already naked by the time he was run over. The police separated the truck drivers, and both claimed to have seen a man in a bright jacket walking around the wreckage, but he had vanished by the time they'd called the police. The 4 men, the location Stoll was run over, and the meaning of the letters Stoll had written remain unknown to this day. Maybe YOGTZE was actually an anagram for zygote, and he had possibly discovered some secret relating to genetically modified organisms. Some say maybe it can be read upside down, that perhaps he was referring to TZE, which is supposedly a yogurt flavoring. That maybe it was the license plate of the men who eventually murdered him. Maybe the G was really a 6, and YO6TZE is actually the call sign of a radio station in Romania. Those are just some of the many theories. It's possible that we will never know the answer. Sometimes, when monsters avoid justice, it's due to sheer luck. Other times, due to meticulous planning. In this case, it's due to a community that decided to get their own justice. You can decide if they're the monsters in this case or not. Ken McElroy was one of 16 children, born to a migrant couple struggling to make ends meet by tenant farming. After moving around for several years, they'd all finally settled in Skidmore, Montana. Ken McElroy dropped out of school in 8th grade at the age of 15. Soon after, he developed a pretty bad reputation because along with being a raccoon hunter and cattle rustler, he was deemed a thief and a womanizer by the locals. Over the course of 2 decades, McElroy was suspected of stealing gasoline, livestock, grain, alcohol, and antiques. He avoided all 21 charges brought against him, likely because he'd stalked anyone who was a witness and intimidated them into silence. He was also a father of over 10 children with numerous different women. His last wife was Trina McLeod. When they met, she was merely 12 years old. She became pregnant by him at 14, causing her to drop out of school in 9th grade. She moved in with McElroy and his 3rd wife, Alice. He then divorced Alice and married Trina to avoid statutory rape charges. Eventually, Trina gave birth, and 16 days later attempted to escape to her parents' home with Alice and the baby. When McElroy discovered them missing, he tracked them to Trina's parents' house and ordered them to return home with him. Later, McElroy returned to Trina's parents' home, waited for them to leave, and murdered their dog then burned down the house. McElroy was indicted soon after in June of 1973 for charges of statutory rape, arson, and assault. He was arrested and later released on a $2,500 bail. Trina and the baby were placed in foster care. McElroy would wait outside the foster home in his car, staring, for hours on end. He told the family he would, quote, trade girl for girl, implying that he knew where she went to school and even her bus route, and would go to great lengths to get her back. These threats led to even more charges for McElroy, but he didn't stop there. Like any proper lunatic, he never knew when to quit. Just 3 years later, in 1976, a farmer named Romaine Henry stated that McElroy had shot him with a shotgun twice after he confronted McElroy for shooting guns on his property. He was charged with assault, with intent to kill, but denied he was at the scene. As the case was coming along, Henry alleged to have seen McElroy parked outside of his home over 100 times. McElroy had an alibi, however. 2 of his buddies stated that McElroy had been with them at the time of the crime, an entirely different location. Henry was then questioned by McElroy's attorney and was forced to admit to concealing a petty crime that he'd committed more than 30 years ago. This put doubt into the jury's heads. Henry's character was evidently sufficiently tarnished from this, as McElroy was swiftly acquitted. Then came 1980, the year everything was put into motion. One of McElroy's children got into a fight with a clerk named Evelyn Sumi while she was working her shift at a local grocery store owned by an elderly couple, Ernest Bonekamp and his wife Lois. It seems a younger McElroy child had attempted to steal some candy and Evelyn had caught him. McElroy, of course, began stalking the Bonecamps, which ultimately culminated in him threatening Bo in the back of his store with a shotgun. During the ensuing argument, McElroy shot Bo in the neck. Miraculously, he survived, and McElroy was arrested and charged with attempted murder. Oh man, isn't that a great resolution? Except this is a video about unsolved murders, so this isn't quite the end. McElroy was convicted of assault at trial, but released on bail pending his appeal. McElroy, being the persistent nutcase that he was, went to a local bar, the D&G Tavern, immediately upon his release after a post-trial hearing. At the bar, he brandished an M1 Garand rifle, while detailing what he would do to Mr. Bonecamp. Several people in the bar had decided enough was enough and something needed to be done. They approached the police to see what could be done to prevent McElroy from becoming a threat to anyone else. The Nottoway County Sheriff Dan Estes suggested they form a neighborhood watch, which might have been of some sort of benefit if most of the town weren't terrified of him. After McElroy's appeal hearing was once again delayed, the town held a meeting at the Legion Hall with the sheriff, looking to him for advice on how to protect themselves. Again, he stated that they needed to form a neighborhood watch. He also advised them to avoid any confrontations with McElroy. He then drove out of town. During the meeting, word had gotten around that McElroy was at the bar. After the sheriff left, the townspeople decided to go do exactly the opposite of what the sheriff had advised, and flocked to the bar. So many of them, in fact, that the bar was soon full. They stood silently as McElroy finished his drink and bought a six-pack to go. He left the bar and entered his pickup truck, where he was promptly shot at several times. He was struck twice, one bullet coming from a centerfire rifle, and the other from a .22 rimfire rifle. No one called an ambulance. Out of the 46 potential witnesses at the scene, only Trina McElroy, who sat next to her husband in the truck when he was murdered, identified a gunman. The DA declined to press charges, and a thorough federal investigation didn't lead to any either. In 1984, Trina filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the town, the sheriff, the mayor, and against Del Clement, who she claimed was the murderer. The case was settled out of court for $17,600. No one admitted guilt, but stated it was to avoid costly legal fees if it were dragged out. 37 years later, the town hasn't forgotten this incident. The new sheriff has stated that it was at the bottom of the list of unsolved murders the former sheriff left for him. He's not sure he really cares to look into it, and it's not one of his priorities. So who's the monster here? The townspeople? The sheriff? McElroy? Leave your thoughts down below in the comments if you want, and I'll check those out. Our last case seems to be right out of a Sherlock Holmes story, maybe quite literally. Richard Greene was a British scholar of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. In fact, he was widely considered to be the world's foremost scholar on these topics. Greene was born in 1953 to Roger and June Greene. His father was a famous author known for his adaptations, and his mother was a drama teacher who'd went to college and earned a degree in English. His fascination with Sherlock began quite early. By age 7, he'd already accumulated a massive collection of Sherlock-related memorabilia. In fact, he'd created his vision of 221B Baker Street in the attic of his home. Later in life, he co-edited a very comprehensive bibliography of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, as well as a series of unreleased writings from Doyle, including uncollected stories, essays on photography, and letters to the press. He and John Michael Gibson, the man he'd co-edited with, received an Edgar Award from Mystery Writers of America for their efforts. He also published his own works. He made an anthology of non-canon Sherlock Holmes stories entitled The Uncollected Sherlock Holmes. He made a collection of parodies entitled The Further Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And finally, Letters to Sherlock Holmes, which is a collection of the most interesting letters to Sherlock. In fact, he was planning to make a 3-part biography of Conan Doyle. He was even chairman of the Sherlock Holmes Society from 96 to 99, even going so far as to show up to events for the society in the proper period appropriate attire. He was quite dedicated to his love of Holmes. Apparently, in the last days of his life, Greene suspected that the Doyle writings on auction at Christie's that had belonged to Conan Doyle's daughter Jean actually belonged to the British Library because it's what he believed she'd intended. He tried and failed to stop the auction. In the weeks leading up to his death, Greene told friends that he was being followed by an American due to his attempted interference in the Christie's auction. His behavior changed, becoming more erratic. Visitors were asked to meet in the garden because he believed his house was bugged. On the night of his death, his sister called his apartment but was directed to the answering machine. She became startled by an American voice speaking on the tape, but it turns out that it was the standard message that came with the machine. However, due to this, and the worry it caused her, Greene was found face down on his bed, strangled to death with a garrote made out of a shoelace and tightened with a wooden spoon. It was suspected to be murder at first, but there was gossip. Not helping matters was the fact that the Criminal Investigation Department, or CID, had not been called from the beginning. Since that time, any evidence that may have been useful for a murder inquiry had long since been either removed or disturbed at the very least. The coroner returned with an open verdict, and many of his friends claimed he would never have done such a thing, though there were a few that believed his death to be some sort of incredibly elaborate suicide, meant to look like a murder to cast doubt onto his enemies. If this sounds familiar, that may be because it was the plot of a Holmes novel entitled Problem at Thor's Bridge, in which a woman commits suicide in a way that implicates the woman her husband had been cheating with. The case is still unsolved and has inspired 2 novels, The Art of Detection and The Sherlockian, if you want to go check those out. Well, that's all for now. Remember, be wary of the monsters out there.